The coffee shop was small, intimate. The kind of place where people whispered over their lattes, where the soft clinking of spoons against porcelain cups was the loudest sound. It wasn't the place for a heated argument, but that didn't seem to stop Karoline Leavitt. She sat at a table near the window, a copy of her latest novel resting beside her cappuccino. The afternoon light streamed in, highlighting the sharp set of her jaw, the slight tremor in her fingers as she tapped them against the ceramic cup. The air had shifted. A tension settled in the room, thick and unavoidable. Karoline's eyes were locked onto the person across from her, Avery Cole. Avery was young, in their 20s, maybe. Short auburn hair, piercing blue eyes, and an expression that carried equal parts defiance and exhaustion. Their hands were clasped around a black coffee, fingers tight against the heat. "What you're saying," Avery said, their voice low but controlled, "is that no matter what I feel, what I know to be true, I'll always just be a man," Karoline interjected, leaning forward slightly. "Biology doesn't change because of feelings. Science is real, and you can't rewrite it just because it makes you uncomfortable." A ripple went through the cafe. People weren't pretending not to listen anymore. A woman at the next table slowly turned her head, her spoon suspended mid-air over a bowl of soup. A man in a blazer glanced up from his laptop, eyes flicking between them like he was watching a live debate unfold. Avery exhaled through their nose, a flicker of something dangerous passing over their face. "Science is real," they repeated, nodding. "And you know what science tells us? That gender and sex aren't the same thing. That chromosomes don't dictate identity. That people have been transitioning for centuries, whether you like it or not." Karoline scoffed. "Centuries? What, you mean eunuchs? That's not the same thing as this modern obsession with redefining what's real. Women are women. Men are men. That's how the world works." Avery tilted their head, studying her. "And yet, here I am, a man, living as a woman. And the world hasn't ended." Karoline's lips pressed together. "You can call yourself whatever you want," she said, voice tight. "You can wear a dress, grow your hair out, take hormones. But you will never be less of a person than you." Avery interrupted, their voice sharp. "Because that's what you're really saying, isn't it?" Karoline's expression darkened. "That's not what I said." Avery leaned forward now, mirroring her posture. "But it's what you mean. You want to strip away who I am. You want to tell me I don't exist. You think I'm a delusion. I think you're confused." Silence. Avery let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking their head. "You have no idea how condescending that is, do you?" Karoline sat back, folding her arms. "I don't care if it sounds condescending. I care about the truth." Avery's jaw tightened, but before they could respond, another voice cut through the room. "She's right, you know." Both of them turned. An older man, maybe in his 60s, sat near the door. His gray suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. He wasn't part of the conversation, hadn't been invited into it, but that didn't seem to bother him. "Facts don't care about feelings," the man said, taking a sip of his coffee. Avery's hands curled into fists. Karoline smiled slightly, as if she had just won a round in some invisible battle. But Avery wasn't done. Not even close. They turned back to Karoline, and when they spoke again, their voice was calm. Too calm. "You're so sure of yourself. So convinced that you get to decide what's real and what's not." Karoline raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Avery continued, voice barely above a whisper. "So what happens when you're wrong?" A chill passed through Karoline, though she wouldn't admit it. Wrong? She wasn't wrong. Was she? Karoline's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. The cafe wasn't just listening anymore. It was watching. Avery's question lingered between them like a smoke trail after a gunshot. "So what happens when you're wrong?" Karoline's instinct was to brush it off. She wasn't wrong. The world operated on reality, not feelings. Men were men. Women were women. That wasn't cruelty, it was truth. And yet, something about Avery's tone unsettled her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't outrage. It was something worse. Certainty. "I'm not wrong," she said finally, her voice firm. Avery studied her for a moment before leaning back, taking a slow sip of their coffee. That's the funny thing about people who say that, they murmured. They never think they are. Right up until the moment the ground shifts under their feet. Karoline exhaled sharply, irritated. The ground doesn't shift when it's built on fact. Avery tilted their head slightly, as if considering that. Facts evolve. No, Karoline snapped. Facts are facts. Avery sighed. Okay, let's try something different. They set their cup down, folding their hands on the table. What makes a woman, Karoline? Karoline scoffed. Really? That's your argument? A woman is an adult human female. XX chromosomes. The ability to bear children. Basic biology. Avery nodded, slowly. So if a woman is someone who can bear children, what does that make a woman who can't? Karoline's jaw clenched. You know that's not what I meant. Avery lifted an eyebrow. Do I? Because it sounds like you just said a woman is only defined by her reproductive system. So what about women who've had hysterectomies? Or women born with medical conditions that make them infertile? Are they suddenly not women? That's different, Karoline said stiffly. Why? Avery pressed. Because they're still women biologically, she snapped. Avery's expression didn't change. Even though their bodies don't meet the criteria you just set? Karoline felt a spark of frustration. They're still XX. They still are women, whether or not they can have children. Avery's lips curled slightly. So it isn't just about biology, then. You just proved your own point. Karoline opened her mouth, then closed it. The cafe was dead silent. Even the espresso machine behind the counter seemed to have stopped hissing, as if the entire room was waiting for her response. Her heartbeat ticked a little faster. She wasn't used to feeling unsteady in arguments. She was right. Wasn't she? Avery's voice softened, but the steel remained underneath. You act like this is about protecting truth. But it's not. It's about protecting your truth. The one that makes sense to you. The one you don't want to question. Karoline inhaled through her nose, forcing calm. If I'm questioning anything, it's how we got to a place where reality is suddenly up for debate. Where words don't mean what they used to. Where men can declare themselves women and expect everyone to just go along with it. Avery's eyes darkened. And yet, here we are. The world didn't collapse. Society didn't crumble. You're just uncomfortable because people stopped asking for your permission to exist. Something about that struck deep, but Karoline shoved it down. I don't need to give permission for people to exist, she said. But I do have a right to stand by reality. Avery's lips pressed together. They looked down for a moment, staring at the black surface of their coffee like it held an answer they didn't want to say aloud. Then, slowly, they reached into their jacket pocket. Karoline's muscles tensed. Avery placed something on the table between them. A photograph. Karoline blinked, taken off guard. It was old, slightly crumpled at the edges. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, standing on a beach, wind in her hair, eyes bright with laughter. Karoline frowned. What is this? Avery exhaled. That's me. Karoline's stomach twisted slightly. Avery didn't look at her, just kept their eyes on the photograph. That's me before I had words for what I was. Before anyone told me I was wrong. Before people like you made it their mission to remind me that no matter what I did, I would never be enough. Karoline swallowed. Avery. I spent years trying to be what people wanted. And it almost killed me. Avery's voice was quiet, but it cut through Karoline like a knife. Karoline felt the weight of the words press against her ribs. She knew that weight. She had carried it, once, in a different form. Avery shook their head, pushing the photo closer to her. You look at me and see someone who's pretending. But I look at that kid, they pointed at the photo, voice tightening, and I see someone who was drowning in a body that didn't belong to them. And you think I should have stayed that way. That I should have just accepted it. Karoline opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Avery's hands curled into fists. Do you have any idea what it feels like to wake up every morning and feel like you're wearing someone else's skin? Karoline's throat tightened. She did know. Not in the same way. Not exactly. But she knew what it was like to not fit. To feel like the world had given her a script she didn't want to follow. Her own past flickered in her mind. The quiet battles no one ever saw. The choices she made. The ones she still wasn't sure about. Avery leaned back, shaking their head. You don't care about truth. You care about keeping the world the way it makes sense to you. You care about making sure people like me never get to feel whole. Karoline inhaled sharply, something twisting hard in her chest. Because for the first time in this argument, she wasn't sure she liked what she saw in herself. The cafe wasn't just quiet now. It was holding its breath. Karoline could feel the weight of a dozen eyes pressing against her skin. The man in the gray suit near the door was still watching, his expression unreadable. A barista in the corner had stopped mid-wipe, her cloth frozen against the counter. Even the espresso machine, which had sputtered to life moments ago, had quieted again as if the universe itself had conspired to make this moment stretch longer than it should. The photograph between them sat like a landmine on the wooden table. Avery wasn't speaking anymore. They just sat there, staring at Karoline, waiting. Waiting for what? An apology? A concession? Neither was coming. Karoline set her jaw and looked away from the photo, pushing it back toward Avery with the tip of her finger. I don't doubt that you've struggled, she said, voice taut. But struggle doesn't change facts. Avery's lips parted slightly, almost as if they were surprised she could still be saying this. Karoline went on, forcing her voice to stay steady. You talk about feeling like you didn't belong in your body. And I can acknowledge that. But feelings don't define reality. You were born male. That doesn't change just because you felt different. Avery let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Wow. You really don't get it. I do get it, Karoline shot back, her frustration rising. I get that you think. Avery slammed their hand down on the table. Not hard, but enough to make Karoline flinch. Enough to make the watching cafe tense. Stop saying that, Avery hissed. Karoline stiffened. You don't get it, Karoline. Avery's voice was lower now, but sharp as glass. You don't get to sit there, having never lived a single day as me, and tell me what I think. You don't get to reduce my life to some kind of delusion just because it doesn't fit into your neat little worldview. Karoline inhaled sharply. It's not about my worldview. It's about reality. Avery cut in. Their eyes were burning now. Let me tell you something about reality, Karoline. Reality is waking up every day in a body that doesn't feel like yours. It's looking in the mirror and wanting to tear your own skin off because every inch of it feels wrong. Reality is spending years trying to fit into a mold that people like you say is the only one that matters, until you can't anymore. A bitter smile twisted their lips. And you know what reality also is? It's lying in bed at night, wondering if it's even worth being here because people like you will never see you as anything more than a joke. Karoline's heart kicked hard in her chest. Something had shifted. The cafe wasn't just watching now. It was feeling. A woman near the counter bit her lip, her fingers clenched around her paper cup. A young man at the window lowered his phone, suddenly uninterested in scrolling. Avery shook their head, voice quieter now. I tried everything to make people like you happy. I spent years hating myself, trying to be what I was told I was supposed to be. I nearly died because of it. They leaned forward, their hands gripping the table's edge. And I need you to understand something, Karoline. I survived you. Karoline's breath caught in her throat. Avery's voice didn't shake. Their hands didn't tremble. There was no hesitation, no doubt. Karoline could argue biology. She could argue definitions. But she couldn't argue with the person sitting across from her, looking her dead in the eyes, telling her that her words, the ones she had always considered truthful, logical, factual, had nearly killed them. A hollow sort of silence filled her chest. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Avery exhaled slowly, like they were letting go of something they'd held inside for too long. They sat back in their chair, running a hand through their hair. Then they laughed. A short, tired sound. You know what's funny? Their voice was softer now, almost gentle. I didn't come here to argue with you. I didn't wake up today thinking, hey, I'd love to debate whether or not I should exist. They shook their head. But that's the thing about people like you. You force us to fight for something that should never be up for discussion in the first place. Karoline swallowed hard. She wasn't used to losing arguments. She wasn't losing. Was she? Avery sighed and stood up. The cafe seemed to shift around them. People who had been frozen in place suddenly pretended to be occupied with their drinks, their books, their laptops. The barista behind the counter turned away quickly, focusing hard on the espresso machine. Karoline felt a strange tight sensation in her chest as Avery looked down at her. You're not going to change your mind, they said. Not a question. Just a statement. Karoline hesitated. No. Avery nodded, like they'd expected it. I figured. They grabbed the photograph from the table and tucked it back into their pocket. Then, before turning to leave, they met Karoline's gaze one last time. You can keep telling yourself you're right, Avery murmured. But deep down, I think you're more afraid than you let on. The words sank deep. And then Avery walked away. The cafe, which had been utterly still, seemed to release a breath the moment the door swung shut behind them. Karoline stared at the empty space across from her. Her hands were cold, gripping the sides of her cup. She wasn't sure why, but she suddenly wasn't thirsty anymore. The cafe was still. Not silent, not exactly, but still. Like a room after an argument, after something heavy had been said and couldn't be unsaid. Conversations had resumed, the clinking of spoons against cups had returned, but it wasn't the same as before. Karoline sat there, staring at the empty chair across from her. Her hands curled around the cooling ceramic of her coffee cup, but she wasn't drinking. She wasn't thinking about the taste, the warmth, the reason she had come here in the first place. She was thinking about Avery's last words. I think you're more afraid than you let on. Karoline scoffed under her breath and sat back in her chair. Afraid? Of what? Of some 20-something's feelings? Of a world where people believed whatever they wanted, facts be damned? She wasn't afraid. She was right. And yet, the cafe door swung open again, making her pulse jump, but it wasn't Avery. Just a man in a heavy coat shaking the drizzle from his sleeves before heading to the counter. Karoline let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She shouldn't care. She had nothing to prove. And yet, she glanced around, feeling the weight of eyes, not directly, but in flickers. The way the barista at the counter seemed to avoid looking her way. The way the man near the window, the one who had been scrolling his phone, glanced at her with something unreadable before turning back to his screen. The way the woman at the next table stirred her coffee in slow, lazy circles, not drinking, just watching. She had won the argument, hadn't she? Then why didn't it feel like a victory? Her fingers drummed against the table, restless. She needed to get out of here. She pushed back her chair and grabbed her bag, her movements stiff, deliberate. She wasn't running. She wasn't bothered. She was just done. She turned toward the door. And then, you know, I used to think like you. The voice stopped her cold. Karoline turned slowly. The woman at the next table, the one who had been stirring her coffee without drinking, was watching her now, head slightly tilted. She looked to be in her 40s, maybe early 50s, with tired eyes and a careful sort of expression. Karoline narrowed her gaze. Excuse me. The woman shrugged, setting her spoon down at last. I used to think like you, she repeated, folding her hands in her lap. That trans people were confused. That they were forcing the rest of us to deny reality just to make them feel better. Karoline didn't sit back down, but she didn't leave either. And now you don't? She asked flatly. The woman gave a small, dry chuckle. No. Now I don't. Karoline crossed her arms. Let me guess. Someone gave you a lecture about gender theory, and suddenly you threw out everything you knew to be true. The woman shook her head. No. My son came out as trans. Karoline's stomach tightened, but her expression didn't change. The woman leaned forward slightly. I was like you. I told him he was mistaken. That he was going through a phase. That biology was biology, and nothing he said would change that. She exhaled. He stopped talking to me for almost a year. Karoline swallowed but said nothing. I told myself I was standing by the truth. That one day, he'd come around. That he'd thank me for not feeding into his delusion. The woman's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. You know what happened instead? Karoline's voice was quieter than she wanted when she said, "What?" The woman met her gaze. He tried to kill himself. A silence like ice settled between them. Karoline's pulse kicked hard, but her expression didn't waver. The woman shook her head slightly, as if she were still trying to make sense of it. He survived, thank God. But that was the moment I realized I had two choices. I could be right, or I could have my child. Karoline's throat felt tight. That's not, she exhaled sharply. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? The woman lifted an eyebrow. Tell me, what do you think you accomplished today? Karoline blinked, thrown by the sudden shift. Excuse me. You sat here and told that person that who they are isn't real. That their existence is wrong. The woman tilted her head. So, what do you think that did? Do you think they're walking away from here suddenly realizing, wow, Karoline was right. I guess I am just a man in a dress. Karoline flinched at the sharpness of it. The woman's voice softened, but it didn't lose its weight. Or do you think they walked out of here carrying just a little more of that heaviness they've had to carry their whole life? Do you think you made them safer? Karoline felt something cold crawl up her spine. The truth isn't about safety. Maybe not, the woman said. But people like you, people like me, you don't just want to be right. You want to make sure they know they're wrong. You want to make sure they feel it. She picked up her coffee and took a slow sip. And why do you think that is? Karoline clenched her jaw. She didn't have an answer to that. And she hated that she didn't. She turned away, gripping the strap of her bag. I'm not doing this. The woman didn't stop her. But as Karoline stepped toward the door, she heard her say, almost casually, "You don't have to believe in something for it to be real, you know." Karoline stiffened. She could feel the weight of the words chasing her out the door, even as she stepped into the cool air outside. The street was bustling, normal, uncaring of the storm still raging in her head. She walked. Not fast. Not slow. Just moving, as if distance could shake off the feeling in her chest. You don't have to believe in something for it to be real. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. No. She was right. She was. And yet. As she walked, Karoline realized she wasn't thinking about chromosomes or definitions or biology. She was thinking about a photograph. A little girl standing on a beach, wind in her hair. And the person who had once been that little girl, walking away from her, carrying something heavier than she'd ever understand.